My name is Rebecca Lane, and I am 39 years old, and I want you to sit down for this one. I want you to find a comfortable place, and I want you to settle in. Because what I am about to tell you is not a short story. It is not a neat little tale with a beginning and a middle and a clean ending that wraps up in 30 minutes. It is a decade and a half of living. A decade and a half of being told you are not enough, and proving every single day in every single quiet way that you are more than enough. It is the story of a girl who sat at a dinner table for 20 years and listened to her own family call her slow, call her simple, call her the one who just doesn't quite get it. And it is the story of what that girl did with all of that, what she built with all of that, what she became with all of that. And I promise you that by the time I finish telling you this, you will understand something important. Something that took me years to understand myself, which is that being underestimated is not the end of your story. It is actually the most powerful beginning you could ever have. Because no one watches the person they've already written off. No one pays attention to the one they've decided doesn't matter. And when no one is watching you, you can build absolutely anything. And that is exactly what I did. I built absolutely anything, and then I built more than that. So let me take you back. Let me take you all the way back to a house on Callaway Road in a small city called Martin in the state of Georgia. A house that was never quite big enough for the family that lived in it, but was always somehow expected to contain everyone's dreams, and everyone's disappointments, and everyone's particular brand of cruelty toward the person who happened to be the easiest target. And in our family, that person was me. It was always me. From the time I was old enough to sit at the table and understand what the words meant, it was me, Rebecca Lane, the youngest of 3 children, the quiet one, the slow one, the one who took longer to read out loud in school, the one who had to ask the teacher to repeat things, the one who stared out the window more than she stared at the board. And I want to tell you something about that girl. I want to tell you what was actually happening inside her, while everyone around her decided what she was and what she wasn't. Because the thing about being labeled early is that the label sticks not because it's accurate, but because everyone around you behaves as though it is. And when enough people behave as though something is true, you start to perform it even when it isn't. You start to inhabit the shape of the box they've put you in, because the box is all you've ever been shown, and you don't yet know that you have the power to step outside of it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about my family first. Let me give you the full picture, because none of what comes later makes sense without the foundation. My father was Gerald Lane, a man who had worked at the same insurance company for 30 years, and who wore the same brand of shoes every single year, and who had very fixed ideas about how the world worked, and who was capable of what within it. My father was not a bad man. I want to say that clearly. He was not cruel in the way that people who enjoy cruelty are cruel. He was just profoundly certain about things that deserved more uncertainty. Certain about his children and their capacities and their futures, in a way that closed doors before anyone had the chance to open them. My father decided very early that my older brother Kevin was the smart one. Kevin was 4 years older than me, and he was sharp and quick, and he had my father's jawline and my father's way of walking into a room like he owned it. And my father loved Kevin with the particular love that fathers have for sons who reflect their best ideas about themselves. And then there was my older sister Patricia, 2 years above me. Patricia, who was beautiful and organized and who made lists and kept them, and who my mother called her little manager. From the time Patricia was 8 years old, Patricia was the capable one, the responsible one, the one who would be fine no matter what, because Patricia had her head screwed on right. My mother said that about Patricia so often that it became a kind of family motto. Patricia has her head screwed on right. And then there was me, Rebecca, the youngest, the afterthought in some ways, the one who came along when my parents had already established the pattern of their family and their expectations, and who arrived into a household that had already sorted itself into its roles and found that there was not much left for me to be, except the one who wasn't quite keeping up. I was not diagnosed with anything as a child. I want to be clear about that. There was no learning disability, no processing disorder, nothing clinical that explained why I was slower in school. I think the truth is more ordinary and more painful than that. I think I was a child who learned differently, and who needed more time and more patience, and who existed in a family and a school system that had neither the time nor the patience to figure out what I actually needed. And so I fell behind. And falling behind became the story. and the story became the label, and the label became the box, and the box became my childhood. I remember very specific moments. I remember them with the kind of clarity that your brain reserves for things that wound it. I remember a dinner when I was 9 years old. We were sitting around the table, and my father was asking Kevin about his tense test. Kevin was talking as about getting a 94 on his math test, and my father was beaming the way he always beamed at Kevin. And then he looked at me, asked how I had done on my spelling test, and I said, I got a 68. And the table went quiet in that particular way that tables go quiet. When something confirms what everyone already suspected, and my mother nodded, Patricia looked at her slate. And my father nodded, and Patricia looked at have to accept that slate, and Kevin said nothing. Accent, and I sat there at 9 years old with my 68% spelling test grade, and my father's verdict settling over me like second skin. Skin. And I think that was the moment, and things, that specific Tuesday evening dinner table moment, that was the moment the box got built around me, and I didn't yet know how to refuse it. And the years went on and the pattern deepened. Kevin excelled and was celebrated, and my father talked about him at every family gathering with a pride that filled the room. Kevin was going to go to college. Kevin was going to do something real. Kevin was going to make the Lane name mean something. And Patricia organized and managed and was praised for her practicality and her level-headedness. And I drifted through school, getting average grades and being told in 100 different ways, both direct and indirect, that average was probably the best I could hope for. And here is something I need to tell you, something I need you to understand before we go any further. I was not stupid. I was never stupid. I want to say that without any defensiveness, because I am far enough from that girl now to say it with absolute calm certainty. I was a child who thought differently, who processed things more slowly in some areas and far more quickly in others. I had an extraordinary memory for numbers, for patterns, for spatial relationships. I could look at a floor plan and understand it instantly. I could look at a set of figures and feel where the imbalance was before I had consciously worked it out. I was intuitive in a way that did not translate well to standardized tests or classroom recitation, but that would turn out to be extraordinarily valuable in the real world. But no one in my family saw any of that. My father saw a girl who couldn't spell correctly on Tuesday tests and concluded she was the dumb one. And once Gerald Lane concluded something, he held onto it with both hands. And the thing about being the dumb one in a family is that it affects everything. It's not just about school. It seeps into every interaction, every decision, every family moment. When Kevin wanted to take a business elective in high school, my father drove him to the school to talk to the guidance counselor personally. When I said I was interested in the business elective too, my mother said, Rebecca, honey, I think you should focus on getting your grades up in the basics first. When Patricia got a summer job at a local law firm's reception desk, my father told everyone he met about it for 6 months. When I got a summer job at a real estate office filing papers and answering phones, my mother said, oh, that's nice, dear, in the tone she reserved for things that didn't particularly register, and I noticed all of it. I noticed every single piece of it. I was quiet and I was watching, and I was noticing things that other people thought I was too slow to notice. I noticed that my father talked about Kevin's future as a certainty, and my future as something vague and undefined that might resolve itself somehow. I noticed that when the family talked about who was going to be successful, it was always Kevin, and sometimes Patricia, and never me. I noticed that the extended family had absorbed the same narrative. My aunts and uncles asked Kevin about his plans and Patricia about her goals, and asked me how school was going, in the specifically gentle tone that people use for children they've already privately decided aren't going to amount to much. And all of this noticing went somewhere inside me. It went somewhere deep and quiet. And it became something, not bitterness yet. I was too young for bitterness. It became a kind of resolve. A quiet, stubborn, private resolve that had no specific shape yet, but that existed. That was real. That was sitting inside me like a coal that hadn't yet caught fire. And I want to tell you about the summer I was 16. Because that summer changed things in a specific way. I had been working at that real estate office. For 2 summers by then, the office was run by a woman named Claudette Morrison. She was in her mid-50s and she had built her business from nothing, and she wore red lipstick every single day and drove a car that made my father's eyes go wide, the one time he saw it parked outside. And Claudette had noticed me in a way that almost no adult in my life had noticed me up to that point. She had noticed that I was precise and reliable, and that I had an instinct for the spatial logic of property. She would hand me floor plans and listings, and I would look at them and immediately understand what the property's issues were and what its potential was. I could look at a neglected house on a quiet street and see what it could become in a way that genuinely surprised her the first time I articulated it. And one afternoon in July, Claudette called me into her actual office. Not just the reception area where I filed papers, her actual office with the mahogany desk and the framed certificates on the wall. And she sat across from me and she looked at me for a moment. And she said, "Rebecca, do you know what you're doing when you look at those listings?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "You're doing what takes most agents years to learn. You're seeing value where other people see problems. You're understanding what a property is worth, not just what it's listed for." And I didn't know what to say to that because no adult had ever said anything like that to me before. And she said, "Have you ever thought about real estate as a career?" And I said, "I don't know." And she said, "Well, I want you to think about it." And she handed me a book, a thick, heavy book about real estate investment principles. And she said, "Read this and tell me what you think." And I took the book home and I read it in 4 days. And I came back and I told her what I thought and what I thought was detailed and specific. And she leaned back in her chair when I finished. And she smiled and she said, "Rebecca Lane, you are going to surprise a lot of people." And I held those words inside me for years. I held them like something precious, like something I could take out and look at on the hard days when my family's version of me felt too heavy to carry. And I want to tell you something that happened that same summer because it is important. It is part of the foundation of everything that came later. My father's brother, my Uncle Dale, came to visit, and there was a family fete dinner. And at that dinner, Uncle Dale talked about a piece of land outside of Marden that was going up for sale. A parcel of about 3 acres on the edge of the neighborhood where we lived. Scrubby land. Nobody's first choice, but land. And Uncle Dale said it was going cheap because no one wanted it. And my father and Kevin and Dale sat around the table after dinner, talking about it. In the way men in my family talked about things that didn't involve me, loud and opinionated and certain. And Kevin said that land wasn't worth anything because the road access was terrible. And my father agreed, and Dale said he'd heard the same, and they moved on to something else. And I sat at that table, and I thought about what I knew about that parcel. I had seen it listed at the real estate office, and I had looked at it, and I had thought about the road access. And I had also thought about something else. I had thought about the fact that Marden City Planning Commission had been discussing a road extension project that would bring a new connector road right past that parcel within 3 to 5 years. It was public information. It was in the meeting minutes that Claudette had me file sometimes, and that road extension would make that and scrubby 3-acre parcel extremely valuable. And I sat at that dinner table at 16 years old, and I thought about saying something. I thought about opening my mouth and telling my father and Kevin and Dale what I knew, and then I thought about how they would receive it. I thought about the look my father would give me, that particular patient dismissive look, and I thought about Kevin's smirk. And I decided not to say anything. I decided to file the information away. And I decided something else too. Something that I didn't fully articulate to myself until years later, but that was already forming clearly in my 16-year-old mind. I decided that when the time came, I was going to use what I knew, not to prove anything to anyone yet, just to use it. Just to see what happened when someone who had been written off started quietly making moves. And that decision, that quiet Tuesday evening decision at a family dinner table, while my father and brother and uncle talked over my head about things they assumed I couldn't understand. That decision was the first brick of everything I eventually built. And the years between 16 and 22 were years of accumulation. Accumulation of knowledge and of money in small, careful amounts, and of understanding about how the world actually worked. I graduated from high school with grades that were unremarkable by anyone's standard except my own, because I knew what those grades had cost me and what they represented given the environment I had been learning in. And I did not go to college. This was treated by my family as confirmation of what they had always suspected. Kevin went to the University of Georgia on a partial scholarship, and my parents stretched financially to cover the rest. And they did it without complaint. Because Kevin was the investment, Patricia had gone to a state school 2 years before, and my parents had helped with that too. And when I said I wasn't going to college, my father said, "Well, Rebecca, you were always more of a practical kind of person." And my mother said, maybe you'll find something that suits you. And neither of them asked me what I wanted to do instead, or offered any resources, or expressed any interest in what my plan was, because in their minds I didn't have a plan. I was just Rebecca, the one without a plan, the one who drifted. And I let them think that because what I actually had was not a plan, that they would have recognized as a plan. What I had was a system. After high school, I went to work full-time at Claudette's real estate office. I got my real estate license at 19. I studied for it on my own with the same focused intensity I brought to everything when no one was watching me. And I passed on my first attempt, and Claudette celebrated with a bottle of sparkling wine and 2 glasses in her office. And she said, I told you so, and I said, you did. And she said, now the real education begins. And she was right. It did. Working full-time in that office was the education that no classroom had ever given me. I learned how properties were valued, and how deals were structured, and how financing worked, and how the relationship between land and time and development could create wealth that seemed almost magical if you didn't understand the mechanics behind it. And I understood the mechanics. I understood them with an intuitive precision that continued to surprise even Claudette, and I started saving. Every dollar I made that wasn't going to my share of the household expenses, because I was still living at home, paying a modest amount to my parents every month, which they accepted without comment. Every dollar beyond that went into a savings account that I opened at a bank across town, and that I told no one about. And I lived carefully. I drove the same second-hand car for 4 years. I brought lunch from home every day. I didn't go on vacations or buy expensive things. I accumulated. Slowly and deliberately and invisibly I accumulated. And then I was 20 years old, and the land parcel on the edge of the neighborhood came back into my awareness. The road extension project had been confirmed. It was in the local paper, a small article that most people in Marden would have skimmed past. But I had been watching for it for 4 years, and I did not skim past it. I read every word, and I felt the specific satisfaction of someone whose long-held thesis has just been proven correct. And I called Claudette, and I told her I wanted to buy that parcel, and she looked at me over her desk. And Rebecca, do you have the money? And I told her how much I had saved, and she looked at the listing price, and she said, you're about 12,000 short. And I said, I know, and she looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, I'll loan you the 12,000 and pay me back with interest when you sell it. And I said, Claudette, I can't ask you to do that. And she said, you didn't ask, I offered. And she said, Rebecca, I have been watching you work for 4 years, and I have never seen a 20-year-old with your instincts, physics, and your discipline. And if I'm not willing to bet on you, then I'm not as smart as I think I am. And I borrowed the $12,000 from Claudette Morrison, and I bought that 3-acre parcel on the edge of the neighborhood at age 20. And nobody in my family knew about it. Nobody in my family knew because nobody in my family asked. Nobody thought to ask Rebecca what she was doing with her money or her time, because nobody expected Rebecca to be doing anything interesting with her money or her time. And I want to pause here for a moment. I want to check in with you, because if you're listening to this right now, and you have ever been the person that everyone decided wasn't going anywhere, if you have ever sat at a table where your potential was discussed as a ceiling rather than a floor, I want you to know that the people who underestimate you are making a very costly mistake, and the cost of that mistake gets paid eventually. It always gets paid eventually. So keep going, stay quiet, keep building, because your time is coming, and when it comes, it is going to be extraordinary. And back to the story, I held that parcel for 3 years. 3 years of paying the property taxes out of my savings and watching the road extension project progress through its various bureaucratic fixes, and waiting with the particular patience of someone who has learned that timing is everything. And during those 3 years, my family continued in its patterns. Kevin had graduated and gotten a job at a marketing firm in Atlanta, and my parents talked about him constantly. Kevin this and Kevin that. Kevin's apartment and Kevin's promotions and Kevin's girlfriend, who was lovely and whose parents had a lake house in Tennessee. And Patricia had married a man named Greg, who worked in finance, and they had bought a house in a suburb north of Marden. And my mother visited them regularly and came home with reports about the granite countertops and the backyard and the neighborhood. And I lived at home and worked at the real estate office, and nobody reported on me to anyone because there was nothing to report, or so they thought. And when I was 23, the road extension was completed, and the value of my parcel had more than doubled, and I sold it to a developer who was planning a small commercial strip. And I walked away from that sale with a profit that made me sit in Claudette's office afterward and put my face in my hands for a moment, not from sadness, from disbelief, from the specific dizzy disbelief of someone who has just watched the thing they believed in come true in full color and full dollar amounts. And I paid Claudette back with interest, and she cried a little and tried to hide it, and I bought her lunch, and she told me that was the best investment she'd ever made. And I said, me too. And I want to tell you what I did with that profit because this is where the story starts to become something larger than a single smart land purchase. I did not celebrate extravagantly. I did not buy myself something to show the world that I had arrived. I reinvested. Every dollar went back in. I started researching the Callaway Road neighborhood, my own neighborhood, the neighborhood where my family's house was, where the house I had grown up in sat on a quarter-acre of Georgia soil. I started researching it with the focused intensity of someone who has a very specific and very long-term idea. And what I found when I researched it was exactly what I had suspected for years. Callaway Road and the surrounding blocks were an undervalued pocket of the city. The housing stock was aging but structurally solid. The lots were generous. The proximity to the newly expanded road corridor was going to drive development interest in the area within the next 5 to 7 years. And the current property values had not yet caught up to any of that. They were still priced as though the road extension hadn't happened, and as though the city's growth wasn't pushing steadily in this direction. And I looked at the available properties on and around Callaway Road. And I started making a list, a quiet, private, detailed list. And I started buying, not dramatically, not all at once. I started buying one property at a time. Small properties, rental-ready properties, properties that needed work but had good bones and good lots. I bought my first Callaway Road property at 24, a rental house 3 blocks from my family's home. I paid $87,000 for it, fixed it up with the help of a contractor I had met through the real estate office, and rented it within 6 weeks to a young couple for $900 a month. And I opened a business, a formal business, a real LLC with a proper name and a proper bank account and a proper accountant. And I called it RL Property Group. And I told no one. I told Claudette, obviously, because Claudette was my mentor and my sounding board, and by this point more like family to me than most of my actual family. But beyond Claudette, I told no one, not my parents, not Patricia, not Kevin, nobody. And the invisibility of it, the fact that I was operating entirely outside the frame of anyone's awareness or expectation, was not just a practical advantage. It was a profound psychological relief. When no one knows what you're doing, you don't have to defend it. You don't have to justify it. You don't have to absorb anyone's skepticism or anyone's condescension or anyone's well-meaning but profoundly unhelpful doubts. You just do the work. And I did the work. I did it every day, 7 days a week. I managed the properties myself in the beginning. I was the one who answered the maintenance calls and arranged the repairs and collected the rent and kept the books. I was the one who drove through the neighborhood on weekend mornings, looking at properties with for sale signs and doing the math in my head about whether they were worth pursuing. I was building something real, and I was building it in complete silence, and the silence was my superpower. And I want you to understand that I did not feel lonely in that silence, the way I might have felt lonely in my childhood silence. This was a different kind of quiet. This was the quiet of someone who has found their purpose and is moving toward it without distraction. And the rent income from the first property was reinvested into the deposit for the second property, and the second into the third. It was not fast. None of this was fast. I am not going to tell you that it happened overnight, or that it was easy, or that there weren't months when the numbers were tight, and the repairs were expensive, and the doubt was loud. There were absolutely months like that. There were months when a tenant didn't pay, and a repair cost more than expected. And I sat at my kitchen table, in the house I had finally rented for myself, a small place on the other side of Marden, and I looked at the spreadsheet, and I felt the particular weight of someone who has taken on more than is comfortable, and who is not entirely sure the foundation will hold. But the foundation held. It always held. Because I had built it carefully, and I had chosen well, and I understood the market I was operating in with a precision that was not luck or accident. It was years of accumulated knowledge and observation, and the specific intelligence of someone who had been looking at this particular puzzle for a very long time. And meanwhile, my family went on being my family. Kevin came back to Marden at 28, when the Atlanta marketing job didn't work out the way he'd planned, and he moved into his old bedroom at my parents' house. And my father said it was just a temporary setback. And my mother made his favorite foods, and nobody said anything about the gap between Kevin's confident predictions for himself and the reality he had returned to, because Kevin was the smart one, and the smart one's failures were always temporary setbacks, while the dumb one's successes were always accidents or didn't exist at all. And Patricia and Greg were fine. They were solid and suburban and predictable. And my parents were proud of them in a comfortable way. And I came to family dinners when I came, and I was quiet, and I helped clear the table and answered questions about how work was going with the same vague non-answers I had been giving for years. Because nobody in my family was really asking about my work. They were asking in the perfunctory way that people ask questions they don't expect interesting answers to. And so I gave them uninteresting answers. And I went home and I worked. And I want to jump to something specific now, because I need to tell you about the conversation that happened when I was 27. That in some ways was the fulcrum of this entire story. The moment that in retrospect I can point to and say, that is where everything tilted. It was a Sunday dinner at my parents' house in late October. The leaves were doing their Georgia thing outside the window, and my mother had made her pot roast and everyone was there. Kevin and Patricia and Greg and me. And my father was in one of his expansive moods. The kind he got sometimes when he'd had a glass of wine and felt the particular satisfaction of having his family around him. And he started talking about the neighborhood, about Callaway Road and the surrounding streets. And he said that he had been reading that property values were going up in the area, and that it was about time. Because the neighborhood had been undervalued for years. And Greg, who worked in finance, said yes, he had noticed the same thing. And Kevin said he had been thinking that maybe there was an opportunity there. And my father said, what kind of opportunity? And Kevin said investment, property investment, maybe buy something on the cheap before the prices really took off. And my father said, now that's smart thinking, Kevin. And he said, you know what, maybe I should look into that too. Maybe this old neighborhood still has something to offer, and they talked about it for 20 minutes. My father and Kevin and Greg talked about the investment opportunity in the neighborhood around Callaway Road, the neighborhood where I had been quietly buying properties for 3 years. And I sat at that table and I listened to every word. And I ate my mother's pot roast, and I said absolutely nothing. And my mother at one point looked at me and said, Rebecca, you're quiet tonight. And I said, I'm just enjoying the food, Mom. And she nodded and passed me the rolls, and the conversation moved on. And I drove home that night with something burning very quietly in my chest. Not anger, not satisfaction yet. Something more like the feeling of standing at the edge of something enormous and just beginning to understand the scale of it. And I went home and I opened my files and I looked at what I had. And I thought very carefully about what I wanted to do next. And what I decided was that I was going to accelerate. I was going to move faster than I had been moving. I was going to be less conservative and more bold, because the window that I had identified was real, and it was beginning to close, as other people started to notice what I had been seeing for years. And over the next 18 months, I made 6 more acquisitions in and around Callaway Road. I bought a duplex 2 streets over from my parents' house. I bought a vacant lot at the corner of Callaway and 5th that I held for future development. I bought a small commercial property on the main road that ran through the neighborhood. A tired old building that had housed a dry cleaner for 20 years, and that the retiring owner was ready to let go for less than its actual value, because he wanted the transaction simple and fast, and I could offer him both. And I renovated that commercial property, and found a tenant who signed a 5-year lease, and the rental income from that one property alone covered the mortgages on 2 of my residential rentals. And my portfolio was growing and my revenue was growing. And RL Property Group was becoming a real company with real complexity and real cash flow. And I hired a property manager named James, who was practical and reliable, and who took over the day-to-day so that I could focus on acquisitions and strategy. And I also began to do something that felt slightly audacious, but that Claudette strongly encouraged. I began to attend city planning meetings, officially, as a property owner and local business person. I sat in those meetings, and I listened to everything, and I asked careful questions, and I built relationships with the planners and the commissioners and the local officials who were shaping the future of Marden's development. And those relationships were gold, Not in any corrupt or improper way, simply in the way that being in the room and being informed and being taken seriously as a stakeholder gave me access to information that was public, but that most people never bothered to seek out. And what I learned in those rooms informed every subsequent decision I made about where to buy. And I was 30 when Claudette retired. She sold her real estate office to a larger regional firm, and she came to tell me in person, and she cried again, less hidden this time. And she told me that watching me build RL Property Group had been the greatest professional satisfaction of her career. And I held her hands across the table. And I said, Claudette, none of this exists without you. And she said, it exists because of you, Rebecca. And I said, it exists because of both of us. And she said, okay, both of us. And she went to Florida with her retirement savings and sent me a postcard from the beach that I still have pinned to the wall of my office. And I missed her every day. But I also felt her confidence in me like a structure I could lean against on hard days. And the hard days still came. The business world had hard days. The way everything else had hard days. There was a difficult year when interest rates moved in ways that tightened my financing. There was a tenant situation that turned legal and cost time and money and stress. There was a period when I was managing growth faster than my systems could support, and I had to slow down and rebuild the operational infrastructure before I could accelerate again. But I handled all of it. I handled it with the same methodical, quiet focus I had brought to everything from the beginning. And my family remained entirely unaware of any of it. And I want to tell you something about those family dinners during this period, because they are important to the texture of the story. Those dinners were a particular kind of surreal. Once I knew what I knew about what I was building, I would sit at my mother's table and eat her food and listen to my father praise Kevin's latest project. Kevin had started a small landscaping business after the Atlanta job, and it was doing reasonably well, and my father spoke about it with the pride he reserved for Kevin's endeavors regardless of their scale. And I would listen to Greg talk about finance things, and Patricia talk about the home renovation they were planning, and occasionally someone would ask me something, and I would give a modest answer, and no one would follow up. And the conversation would move on, and I would sit there with the knowledge of what I was doing, of the properties I owned, 3 blocks and 5 blocks and 2 blocks from where we were sitting. And the absurdity of it was sometimes so complete that I had to work to keep my expression neutral. And I was 32 when the first crack appeared in my invisibility. Not because I had done anything to reveal myself, but because the neighborhood had changed enough that people were noticing the changes and starting to ask questions. Properties were being renovated on streets where nothing had been renovated in decades. A new coffee shop had opened in a space that had been vacant for years. The vacant lot at the corner of Callaway 5th had sprouted a construction fence because I had begun development of a small mixed-use building, 4 residential units above 2 commercial spaces. And people in the neighborhood were talking about who was behind all of it, and the name RL Property Group was appearing on building permits and planning documents. And someone eventually connected the RL to a Rebecca Lane. And that someone turned out to be my cousin Cheryl, who was 2 years older than me, and who lived 3 streets over from my parents, and who had always been friendly to me in the slightly pitying way that most of my extended family had been friendly to me. And Cheryl called my mother, and my mother called me, and the call went like this. My mother said, Rebecca, your cousin Cheryl is saying something about a property company and your name. Is there something you want to tell me? And I said, what is Cheryl saying, Mom? And my mother said she's saying that she looked up the permits on the building going up at Cleude and 5th, and the company name is RL Property Group. And she looked it up, and it says, the owner is a Rebecca Lane of Martin, Georgia. And I said, yes, Mom, that's me. And the silence on the other end of that phone call was one of the longer silences I have experienced in my life. And my mother said, I'm sorry, what? And I said, I have a property company, Mom. I've had it for a while. I own several properties in and around the neighborhood. And the silence came again. And then my mother said, Rebecca, why didn't you tell us? And I thought about how to answer that question honestly. And I said, because nobody asked, Mom. And she said, what does that mean? And I said, it means that when I said work was going fine, nobody followed up. It means that the conversation was always about Kevin or Patricia, and I'm not blaming anyone for that. I'm just saying that the space for me to share something like this was never really created. And she was quiet again, and then she said, how many properties? And I told her, and she said, Rebecca, and I said, yes. And she said, "Your father is going to be very surprised." And I said, "I know." And she said, "Can you come to dinner on Sunday?" And I said, "Yes, Mom, I'll come to dinner." And that Sunday dinner was one of the more remarkable meals of my adult life. I arrived, and my father was sitting at the table with an expression I had never quite seen on his face before. He had clearly been processing the information my mother had given him, and the processing had not been simple or comfortable. Kevin was there too. Cheryl had apparently also told Kevin, because Kevin had that particular expression he wore when something had disrupted his sense of the natural order. And Patricia and Greg were there, and the dinner started with a slightly strained normality before my father said, "Your mother tells me you've been investing in real estate." And I said, "Yes, Dad." And he said, "Around here?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "For how long?" And I said, "About 8 years now." And he looked at me for a moment and said, "8 years?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "And you never mentioned it?" And I said, "No, I didn't." And he said, "Why not?" And I said, "Honestly, Dad, because I wasn't sure it would amount to and something that might not work inning. And I didn't want to answer questions about something that might not work." And that was partly true. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was a true part, and my father accepted it with the slightly deflated air of someone who has been handed a reasonable answer to a question they hoped would expose an unreasonable act. And Kevin said what kind of properties, and I told him some of what I had: the residential rentals, the commercial property, the development on Callaway and Fifth. And I watched something move across Kevin's face as I talked. Something complicated that I recognized as the specific discomfort of someone who has held a very certain position about another person for a very long time, and is suddenly confronted with evidence that the position was wrong. And Patricia said, "Rebecca, that's incredible." And I said, "Thank you, Patricia." And Greg said, "What's the portfolio valued at?" And I gave him a general number, not the precise number, the general number. And Greg's eyebrows went up, and he said, "That's serious." And I said, "Yes, it is." And my father was quiet through most of this, and then he said, "Rebecca, I have to say, I had no idea." And I said, "I know, Dad." And he said, "You always seemed like you were just getting along." And I said, "I was doing more than that." And he nodded slowly, and something in that nod, something in the way my father sat with what he had just learned, was both satisfying and sad at the same time. Satisfying because it was real, because the evidence was real and undeniable. And sad because what it confirmed was how thoroughly I had been written off, how completely my family had closed the file on my potential before I had even had a chance to open it. And dinner ended, and people went home, and I drove back to my rental apartment. I was still renting my own home at this point because all my capital was in the business, and I sat with how I felt about that dinner, and what I felt was this. I felt like someone who had just taken the first step out of a box that had been built around them 20 years ago. Just one step. Just the first one. There were more steps coming, and they were coming faster now. And over the next year and a half, things moved. Quickly, the mixed-use building on Callaway and Fifth was completed, and I had a ribbon-cutting moment standing in front of it that I did not share with anyone except James and my accountant and the contractor. A private moment on a Tuesday morning before the tenants moved in. Just me, standing in front of a building I had designed from a vacant lot that everyone else had passed by. And I thought about that dinner at 16, when my father and Kevin and Dale had talked about land being worthless. And I thought about Claudette's postcard, pinned to my office wall. And I thought about every silent dinner and every dismissive nod, and every time someone had called me the practical one, in the tone that meant the unsuccessful one. And I breathed in the Georgia morning air, and I felt entirely and completely like myself for the first time, in a way that had nothing to do with anyone else's recognition, and everything to do with my own. And the development was a success. The residential units rented within 2 months, and one of the commercial spaces signed a 3-year lease with a local bakery, and the other signed with a physical therapy practice. And the cash flow from that building alone was transformative. And I hired a second property manager and a full-time office coordinator, and RL Property Group moved out of my spare bedroom and into an actual office, a leased space in a small professional building near downtown Martin, with my name on the door, Rebecca Lane, RL Property Group. And I stood in that doorway on the first morning, with a coffee in my hand, and I thought about my father saying, "School isn't your thing." And I thought about the box, and I thought, "You have no idea what my thing is." And the family had by now absorbed the basic fact of what I was doing, but had not yet absorbed the scale of it. My mother and father knew I had properties in the neighborhood. and that I had a company, and that it was doing well, but well in their minds still meant relative to their limited expectations of me. Well in their minds meant Rebecca is doing better than we thought. Well in their minds was still measured against ceiling they had installed years ago and had never quite removed, and I let that stand for the time being, because I had learned by now that the full reveal, the complete picture, was worth waiting for, worth presenting at the right moment, and in the right way. And the right moment was coming. I could feel it building the way you feel weather changing. And let me tell you about what happened with Kevin, because Kevin's story is important to what came next. Kevin's landscaping business had grown modestly and then stalled and then declined, and by the time he was 35, Kevin was in a difficult financial position. He had taken on debt to expand the business at a moment when the expansion hadn't been supported by the fundamentals. And the debt was pressing on him, and the business was struggling to make its payments, and Kevin had not discussed any of this with anyone, because Kevin was the smart one. And smart ones don't publicly struggle. And I knew some of this through the family network, through the kind of sideways information that moves through families without anyone formally announcing it. And I knew something else too. I knew that the street where Kevin rented his business's equipment storage space was a street where I owned a commercial property. Not the same building Kevin rented from, but the same block. And the landlord of Kevin's storage space was a man I knew professionally, and through that professional acquaintance, I learned that Kevin was 2 months behind on his rent, and that the landlord was considering his options. And I sat with this information for a couple of weeks, and I thought about what I wanted to do with it. And I want to be honest with you here, because this is where the story could go in a direction that would make me someone different than who I am. I could have used that information to create a situation that was humiliating for Kevin. I could have arranged things in a way that exposed him publicly, or put him in a position of having to come to me for help in front of the family. And I thought about it. I won't pretend I didn't think about it. I was human, and I had history with this person, and some part of me that was still 9 years old at a dinner table wanted something, wanted acknowledgement, wanted the specific satisfaction of the person who dismissed you needing you. But I thought about it properly, and what I decided was that weaponizing someone's vulnerability was not who I wanted to be. It was not the person I had spent 15 years becoming. And so what I did instead was call Kevin directly. I called him on a Thursday afternoon. And I said, "Kevin, I hear your business is having a hard time." And the silence told me everything I needed to know about how surprised he was that I knew. And I said, "I know a few people who work in commercials worth of exploring if you want to talk about it." And the silence stretched longer. And then Kevin said, "Rebecca, I don't need charity." And I said, "It's not charity, Kevin, it's information." And I said, "It's not charity." And a difference. And he was quiet again. And Martin is a Smy said, "How do you know about my situation?" And I said, "Because he's a small city, and I pay attention." And he said, "That's more than I knew about you. And I's business stabilis and Kevin he financing broker." And I said, "I know." And he said, "Ans broker, I trusted." And Kevin got his afterward restruck is and stis rusted. And he said, "I didn't know you knew people like that." And I said, "You're welcome, Kevin." And he said, da yosem spun." And I said, "I didn't know Svanderson." And he was quiet. And then he said, "Yeah, I'm starting to understand." And that was the most honest conversation Kevin and I had ever had. And it was not dramatic. And it was not the scene I had sometimes imagined in my harder moments. But it was real. And it was twin. And it was between adults. And it was enough. And Patricia and I had a different kind of reckoning. Patricia came to my office one afternoon. She had been in the area for a meeting, and she called ahead, and I said, "Come by," and she sat across from me in my office, and she looked around at the space, at the framed city maps on the walls with properties marked, at the filing systems and the whiteboards with projections, and the general organized reality of a real business. And she said, "Rebecca, this is impressive." And I said, "Thank you, Patricia." And she said, "I mean really impressive." And I said, "I know what you mean." And she said, "I feel like I've missed something. Like there was a whole chapter of your life happening that none of us knew about." And I said, "There were several chapters, Patricia." And she said, "Why didn't you tell us?" And I gave her the same honest, partial answer I had given my mother. Nobody asked. And Patricia, being Patricia, the organized one, the one with her head screwed on right, sat with that for a moment and then said, "That's fair." And I said, "It is." And then she said, "I want you to know that I'm sorry for that." Not for any specific thing, but just for the general thing of not paying attention. And I looked at my older sister, and I thought about all the time she had accepted the family's narrative about me without questioning it. And I also thought about the fact that she was sitting across from me now saying she was sorry, and that those two things could both be true simultaneously. And I said, "Thank you, Patricia." And I said, "I appreciate you saying that." And she said, "Can we have lunch sometime? Just us." And I said yes, and we did. We started having lunch once a month, and it became something real, a relationship between adults that neither of us had quite managed to build when we were younger. And my father was the last and the hardest, because my father was the original author of The Box and the Box. And my father were inseparable in my history. And I want to tell you about the moment with my father, because it was not what I expected. And it moved me in ways I didn't fully anticipate. I was 34 when it happened. My parents had been talking for a while about wanting to downsize. The house on Callaway Road was big for two people, and the maintenance was more than my father's retired self wanted to manage. And they had been half-heartedly looking at smaller places without finding anything that felt right. And my mother mentioned it to me at one of our now regular Sunday dinners. Dinners that had become more real since the revelation of what I was doing. Conversations at those dinners were different now, not completely transformed, but different. There was a new quality of attention in the room when I spoke, a new quality of genuine interest in what I had to say, and my mother mentioned the downsizing. And I thought about it. And I said I might know of something. And I called James. And I asked about a property in my portfolio, a single-story house I owned 4 blocks from Callaway Road, modest and well-maintained and recently renovated. And I arranged for my parents to see it. And they walked through it, and my mother loved it immediately. And my father walked through it with his careful retired man's way of looking at things. And then he stood in the backyard and looked at the garden space, and he said, "To me, Rebecca, did you renovate this yourself?" And I said my contractor did the work, but I managed the project. And he said it's a good house. And I said I know it is, Dad. And he said, "What do you want for it?" And I told him a number that was below market, significantly below. And he looked at me and he said, "That's not the market rate." And I said, "I know." And he said, "Why?" And I said, "Because you're my parents." And he looked at me for a long moment with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not the patient dismissive expression, and not the pride for someone else expression. Something entirely different. Something that looked like actually seeing me. And he said, "Rebecca, I owe you something." And I said, "Dad, you don't owe me anything." And he said, "I owe you the acknowledgement that I had you wrong." And my breath caught on that. It actually caught. And I said, "Okay." And he said, "I had you figured as one thing, and you were entirely another thing. And I was so certain I couldn't see it." And I said, "Dad, it's okay." And he said, "It's not okay. But thank you for saying so." And then he said, "Your mother and I want to buy the house." And I said, "Good." And we shook hands on it. My father and I, standing in the backyard of a house that I owned in the neighborhood he had raised me in, we shook hands on a deal and looked at each other. And I think we both understood that the handshake was about more than the house. It was the closing of a very long account, not a financial account, the other kind, the kind that accumulates between parents and children when the parents get the child wrong. And the child spends years proving them wrong in the most permanent way possible. And my parents bought the house and moved in 6 months later. And the move went fine, and my mother planted things in the garden. And my father built a raised bed for vegetables, and they settled into the smaller life they had been reaching for, and it suited them. And I was glad, genuinely glad, because whatever the history, my parents were still my parents, and watching them comfortable and settled at House.My owned was something that contained every complicated feeling I had ever had about my family in one complicated moment. And now, let me tell you about the thing that happened when I was 36. Because this is the part that has the quality of something that could not have been scripted. The part where the story takes a turn that feels almost too neat to be true. But that happened exactly as I am about to describe it. There was a community meeting called in Marden, a town hall meeting about a large proposed development. A developer from Atlanta was proposing to buy a significant portion of the Callaway Road area and surrounding blocks and develop a mixed-use neighborhood renewal project, new residential, new commercial, essentially a wholesale reimagining of the neighborhood I had grown up in. And the meeting was packed because Marden had feelings about their neighborhood and about outside developers coming in and changing things. And I went to the meeting not as a concerned resident, but as the largest private property owner in the affected area. And when the meeting opened and the developer's representatives stood up and began their presentation, I sat in the audience and I listened and I watched and I waited. And the developer's presentation was slick and well produced and outlined a vision for the neighborhood that was not without merit in some respects, but that included several elements I had significant concerns about from both a community impact and a property value perspective. And when the floor opened for questions, I raised my hand and I was called on, and I stood up, and I asked my questions, and I asked them with the precision and the detail of someone who understood this specific market better than the people presenting. And there was a shift in the room when I spoke, a quality of attention that told me the other people in the room could feel that these were not civilian questions. These were insider questions. And the developer's representative looked at me with the expression of someone recalibrating, and he said, "And who are you, if you don't mind me asking?" And I said, "My name is Rebecca Lane, and I own RL Property Group, and I am the largest private holder of properties in the area your proposal affects." And the room was very quiet for a moment. And then it was not quiet at all. It was full of the particular energy of a room where something unexpected has just occurred. And I looked out at the faces turned toward me, and I saw some people I knew and some I didn't. And then I saw something that stopped me for just a half second before I continued. I saw my father and my mother sitting 3 rows back. They had come to the meeting because they lived in the neighborhood now. They were residents. And my father was looking at me with an expression that I cannot fully describe even now. Years later, it was pride, but it was more than pride. It was the particular expression of a man who was understanding something for the first time that he should have understood years ago, and who is feeling the full weight of that delayed understanding in real time, in public, in a community meeting about the neighborhood he had raised his family in. And I held his gaze for just a moment, and then I turned back to the developer's representative, and I continued asking my questions. And the meeting went on for 2 more hours. And by the end of it, the developer's representative had my business card and a request for a separate meeting with the major stakeholders. And I had agreed to participate in a working group that would give local property owners a voice in how any development in the area proceeded. And I walked out of that meeting hall into the Georgia night, and my father was waiting by the door. And he said, "Rebecca," and I said, "Dad." And he said, "I saw your name on the planning documents, I just didn't put it together." And I said, "I know, Dad." And he said, "How much of this neighborhood do you own?" And I told him the honest number, the actual number, the square footage and the properties and the rough current valuation. And my father sat down on the bench outside the meeting hall and put his hands on his knees and looked at the ground for a moment. And then he looked up at me and he said, "You were doing all of this the whole time?" And I said, "Yes, Dad." And he said, while we were all sitting around that table thinking. And he couldn't finish the sentence. And I said, "I know what you were thinking, Dad." And he said, "I am so sorry, Rebecca." And I said, "Dad." And he said, "No, I need to say it. I called you the dumb one. I let you believe that about yourself. I let this whole family believe that about you, and I was wrong. I was completely wrong." And his voice was rough and not entirely steady. And I sat down next to him on that bench outside the community meeting hall, and I said, "Dad, you weren't entirely wrong about one thing." And he said, "What?" And I said, "I wasn't good at spelling tests." And he made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in that direction. And I said, "But here's what I've learned. The things that made me bad at spelling tests are some of the same things that made me good at this. The way my brain works, the way I see patterns and hold spatial information and understand long-term value. Those things didn't show up in school, the way the things Kevin was good at showed up in school, but they were always there." And my father nodded and he said I should have looked harder. And I said, "Yes, you should have. But I also think that sometimes the things that hold you back in the beginning are the things that push you forward in the end." And my father was quiet. And then he said, "Did it make you angry?" And I thought about the honest answer, and he said, "Yes, Dad. Some of it made me very angry, and some of it made me very determined. And the anger and the determination were not entirely separate things." And he nodded again. And we sat on that bench for a few more minutes in the Georgia night. And then my mother came out and found us and looked between us and understood something from our faces. And she sat down on my other side and took my hand. And we three sat there for a moment before the cold drove us all to our cars. And that was it. That was the moment. That was the confrontation and the reckoning and the acknowledgement. And it was not a scene from a movie. It was a bench outside a community meeting hall, and a father with his hands on his knees, and a daughter who had built an empire in his blind spot. And I drove home that night, and I sat in my car in the parking lot of my apartment building. I had bought myself a proper home by this point, a house I owned rather than rented, a good house with a garden. But I sat in the car before going in, and I thought about everything, all of it, from the spelling test and the dinner table, and the boiler room, and Claudette, and the parcel on the edge of the neighborhood, and the spreadsheet of properties, and the community meeting hall. I thought about all of it as a single continuous thing, and I felt the full weight and the full meaning of it, and I let myself feel it without managing it or making it smaller. And then I went inside, and I made tea, and I sat at my kitchen table, and I thought about what comes next, because here is the thing about building something. You do not build it in order to arrive somewhere and stop. You build it because building is what you do. Building is who you are, and there is always more to build. And so I want to tell you about the 5 years between 34 and 39, because those years were the years of consolidation and expansion, and the quiet but permanent transformation of what RL Property Group was and what I was capable of. By the time I was 35, the portfolio had grown to 31 properties, residential and commercial and mixed use, concentrated in Marden but beginning to extend to neighboring communities. I had a full team, James and 2 additional property managers, and an office coordinator and a part-time marketing consultant, and a full-time accountant, a real team in a real office with a real company culture that I had built deliberately around the values of precision and integrity, and the particular respect for underestimated things that I had developed through lived experience. And I had begun to do something new, something that felt like a natural extension of everything I had learned. I had begun to acquire distressed properties in communities that were structurally similar to what Callaway Road had been 10 years ago. Communities where the housing stock was solid, and the lots were good, and the locations relative to development corridors was favorable, and where the current valuation had not yet caught up to the future reality. And I was good at finding these places, because I had been practicing for 15 years, and because my particular brain, the brain that had failed the spelling test and stared out the window in class, was extraordinarily well suited to this kind of pattern recognition across space and time. I could read a neighborhood the way some people read a book. I could feel where it was heading, and I could act on that feeling with the confidence of someone who had been right about this particular kind of thing enough times to trust the feeling completely. And the portfolio grew and the revenue grew, and by 37 RL Property Group was valued at something that I will not state precisely because I believe in privacy, and because the number is not the point. The point is that the number existed, and that I had built it from a part-time summer job and a book that Claudette handed me, and a parcel of scrubby land that my father and brother had dismissed over pot roast on a Sunday evening. And I want to tell you about something that happened at 37 that felt like the universe was paying attention to the poetry of timing. The Atlanta developer who had presented at the community meeting, and with whom I had had subsequent professional dealings, approached me about a partnership, a formal business partnership, on a significant mixed-use development project in Marden. And the scale of what he was proposing required a local partner with deep knowledge of the area and established relationships with planning commission and the city and the existing community stakeholders. And I was that partner. I was the only person in Marden who was that partner. And we negotiated the partnership over several months, and I brought in a real estate attorney and an investment banker, and we structured a deal that was genuinely equitable and that gave me significant stake and meaningful control over the community-facing aspects of the development. And I signed it on a Tuesday afternoon in my office, on a Tuesday I had come think of as my day. All my important things seemed to happen on Tuesdays, and the project broke ground 8 months later. And it was the largest real estate development project in Marden's recent history. And it was going to take 3 years to complete, and when it was complete, it would include 200 residential units and 40,000 square feet of commercial space, and a community park, and a small public plaza. And it was happening 4 blocks from the house on Callaway Road, where I had grown up being told I was the dumb one. 4 blocks from the kitchen that smelled like burning, and the boiler room where I slept in the cold, and I drove past the construction site sometimes in the mornings on my way to the office. And I looked at it, and I thought about the girl who had sat at that spelling test and gotten 68% and been written off before the ink was dry. And I thought about what Claudette had said, "You are going to surprise a lot of people, Rebecca." And I thought, yes, Claudette, yes, I am, and yes, I did. And I want to tell you about where things stand now, because you deserve the full picture. My family and I have something real now. Imperfect and complicated, the way family things always are when the history is as complicated as ours has been, but real. My mother and father are in the house, 4 blocks away, and I see them regularly. And the conversations are honest in a way they never were when I was growing up. My father asks me real questions about the business and listens to the real answers, and occasionally offers an observation that is more insightful than I would have expected from someone who spent 30 years at an insurance company. Kevin and I are cordial and occasionally something warmer than cordial. The financing situation I helped him navigate turned out to be the beginning of a real restructuring of his business, and he is doing genuinely well now. And we have had conversations that have the quality of adults who have decided to start fresh from where they are rather than from where they were. Patricia and I have our monthly lunches, and they are one of the better things in my life. Patricia has her head screwed on right. My mother always said so, and she does. And having her genuine attention and genuine interest in my work is something I find that I value more than I would have predicted, given everything. The extended family has recalibrated entirely. Those aunts and uncles and cousins who used to ask me how school was going in the gentle tone reserved for lost causes now ask me about the business, with the particular overcorrected enthusiasm of people who are making up for previous dismissiveness. And I accept it without unkindness because I understand that people can only see what they're prepared to see. And preparation takes time. And cousin Cheryl, who was the one who connected the RL on the building permit to my name, Cheryl now tells the story of discovering my company to anyone who will listen in a tone that suggests she was always rooting for me, which she absolutely was not. But I find I am not bothered by this because Cheryl, being Cheryl, is harmless. And the story she tells is at least directionally accurate. And I want to tell you about something I started doing 2 years ago that feels important to include. I started a mentorship program through RL Property Group, a small formal program that works with young people in Marden, who have been told in various ways by various people and systems that they are not capable of significant things. Young people who are, in the language I prefer to use now, differently intelligent, who see the world in ways that don't map onto conventional measures of ability, and I meet with them. And I tell them some version of what I am telling you now, and I show them the work. And I talk about what it means to build something from nothing. And I talk about the specific power of being underestimated. And I talk about patience and documentation and the importance of knowing your own market better than anyone else knows it. And I watch something happen in these young people. When I talk to them, I watch something shift in the way they sit in their chairs, something straighten, something open. And it is the single most satisfying thing I do in any given week. More satisfying than any deal, and more satisfying than any valuation, and more satisfying than any moment of recognition from the people who once thought I would never amount to anything. Because what I am doing for those young people is what Claudette did for me. What Claudette did was see me before I could see myself, and hold that vision steady until I could take it over and hold it myself. And if I can do that for even a handful of people in Marden, then everything that happened in that boiler room and at that dinner table and in every room where someone looked at me and decided I was the dumb one, all of it will have produced something beyond just my own success, something that multiplies and continues past me, and that feels like the truest possible use of everything I went through. And I am 39 years old, and I am sitting in my office on a Tuesday morning. It is always a Tuesday in the important moments, and the construction crane for the development project is visible from my window, and the city is going about its morning business. And I have a meeting in an hour, and a lunch with Patricia at noon, and dinner with my parents on Sunday, and a mentorship session with 3 young people on Thursday, and a full life. A complete life. A life that belongs entirely to me, and that I built with no one's help except Claudette's, and with no map except the one I drew myself in the dark when nobody was watching. And if you have been listening to this story, and you have felt something in it that belongs to you, something that resonates with your own experience of being underestimated, or overlooked, or written off, or placed in a box that someone else built for you. I want you to hear this very clearly. The box is not the truth about you. The box is the truth about the person who built it, and about the limits of their imagination and their vision, and their willingness to look carefully at something they had already decided was not worth looking at. You are not the box. You never were the box. And the work of your life is to build something so undeniably real and so completely your own that the box becomes irrelevant. Not because you prove them wrong, though you will prove them wrong, but because you become so fully yourself that what they thought about you ceases to matter in any meaningful way. The building I put up at Callaway and Fifth did not go up to prove my father wrong. It went up because it was the right building in the right place at the right time. And because I understood that before anyone else did, and because I acted on that understanding with everything I had. The fact that it also happened to be 4 blocks from the house where a 9-year-old girl was told school isn't your thing, is simply the poetry of a life lived with enough patience to let the right moments arrive. And they will arrive. I promise you they will arrive. Keep building, keep documenting, keep showing up in the rooms where the decisions are made. Keep asking the questions that no one expects you to ask. Keep seeing the value where other people see only problems. And one day you will stand in front of something you built, and you will feel what I felt on that Tuesday morning. Outside the building at Callaway and Fifth, you will feel the full weight of what quiet determination over a long period of time can produce. And it will be more than enough. It will be more than you even imagined in the darkest days when the dinner table was loud with other people's praises and silent about yours. It will be more than that. It will be everything. And I am Rebecca Lane. And I was the dumb one. And I own this neighborhood. And I want you to subscribe because there are more stories coming, and every single one of them is about someone who was told they were not enough and who built something that proved the universe disagrees. I will see you in the next one. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. It means more than you know.